Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 4, Secession, Civil War, and Reconstruction, Week 2, the Civil War. Our essential question for this unit is what were the causes, outcomes, and legacies of the Civil War? Last week we covered the causes, and this week we'll cover the events that make up the outcomes of the Civil War. First off is causes of conflicts. Last week, as well as the unit before this, we talked a lot about sectionalism. A big part of sectionalism was, of course, the conflict over the expansion of slavery to the Western territories. This expansion of slavery influenced the balance of political power through representation. We have a struggle between the North and the South over political power, especially in the Senate. This deals a lot with states' rights. The South constantly felt like it was under attack by pro Northern economic issues such as protective tariffs and the National Bank. All of this led up to the idea of secession. South Carolina ends up leaving the Union after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So all of these sectional conflicts come to a head with the election of 1860 that we talked about last week. Once South Carolina seceded, meaning it is leaving the United States of America to create its own country, it claims that all federal property in South Carolina must be turned over to South Carolina. The first event with this is Fort Sumter in Charleston. South Carolina demands that the Union, the United States, surrenders the fort to the Confederacy, to South Carolina. The Union refuses, and the first shots are fired in the war, beginning the conflict. President Lincoln's main goal through the entire Civil War is to preserve the Union, to get all of the states back together. That's why he refused to surrender the fort, because he did not recognize secession and wanted to bring South Carolina back into the country. Here you can see a map, the northern part of the map where the blue and the gray and even the border states there, all of that is part of the Union, the United States. These are the states and territories that did not secede from the United States. The red area are all of the states that seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. So going into the conflict, each side had its own advantages and disadvantages. For the Union, its advantages were many. One of the biggest ones was that most of the industrial power of the country was in northern states, so solidly in Union territory. So lots of factories to produce guns, cannons, uniforms, everything that the country would need to fight a war. Also, they had far more railroads than the South. This means that they could get those goods as well as troops where they needed to go faster. The Union also had a larger population, with nearly two-thirds of the country's population. This makes sense if you remember that most of the major cities are located in the north. This large population meant more men for soldiers as well as laborers. They also had a larger navy and a very strong federal government. With the Confederacy just forming and being a confederation, like if you remember from the Articles of Confederation from Unit 2, it had a very weak central government. So because the Union had a strong federal government, a strong central government, it was a little bit more efficient in making decisions and getting things done. The Confederacy did have some advantages. Things like strong military leadership toward the beginning of the war uh, meant for some early victories. The best example of this is General Robert E. Lee, who was such a good military commander that Abraham Lincoln actually asked him to lead the Union forces at the beginning of the war before Lee had uh, been asked to lead the Confederate troops. The South is also going to be fighting a defensive war. Its goal is not conquering the North, but rather winning independence, defending itself, and fighting long enough for the Union to get tired of the war and basically recognize their independence. Another advantage is that many of the battles are going to be fought in southern states, so they're going to be familiar with their home terrain. They're fighting on their turf. And then lastly, an advantage for the Confederacy going in is that they're motivated um, because many of them felt like they were defending a way of life. So part of this is states' rights. Part of this are the economic issues that were going on, but a very large part is also slavery. So the different strategies that are going to be used play off of those advantages and disadvantages. For the Union, they have a very offensive strategy, and this really comes to a head at the Anaconda Plan, or in the formation of the Anaconda Plan. So the Anaconda Plan has three main parts: to split the South at the Mississippi River, so basically dividing the Confederacy in two; to cut off supplies to the South through a naval blockade; and then finally to take the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. So the Anaconda Plan is aptly named after the large constricting snake that, of course, surrounds its prey and then squeezes it to death. So that's basically what the Union is trying to do to the Confederacy, and we'll look at that in just a minute. So the Confederate strategy, like we said before, is defensive. Defend the region long enough for the North to give up. So basically a war of attrition, just hoping that the Union would eventually grow tired of fighting, run out of troops, run out of resources to fight the war. They also thought that because of the cotton that they grew and Britain's reliance on cotton for its textiles mills would eventually bring Britain into the war on their side, either economically or militarily. However, this never worked. After Abraham Lincoln uh, gave the Emancipation Proclamation, Britain's own abolition movement basically kept it out of the war. So here you can see a cartoon of the time period of the Anaconda Plan in action. So this is from a military leader, Scott. It's nicknamed Scott's Great Snake. So you can see the snake is wrapping itself around the South um, with its head striking at the Mississippi. So the snake along the coastline there is representing that naval blockade, not letting any resources in or out of the South. So because the South already had fewer methods of manufacturing the things that it needed, right? Remember, it's primarily just growing cotton. So it needs to bring things in like food, um, weapons, ammunition, uniforms, all of the supplies that they need. But with the naval blockade, that was much more difficult to do. So this is exactly how the Union ended up winning the war. So the Anaconda Plan worked, and it worked very well. The naval blockade starved the South of resources and basically made things so desperate in the South uh, that they ended up having to surrender. The Union also used its higher population, so it was able to field more soldiers more quickly. And then finally, it just had more resources. It didn't have to depend on imports because of its factory system, and it also had plenty of food and natural materials because of its access to the West. As you saw, most of the West um, was still part of the Union throughout the conflict. Okay, so for key battles, we won't go over too much here, but in your timeline this week, that's where you're going to put more detail for each of these battles as you do your research. So we have the first Battle of Bull Run in 1861. Uh, Basically, both sides went in thinking that this battle was, or that the war overall was not going to be a very long one. Both sides thought it was going to be a very short and mostly symbolic conflict. However, when we see the first battle at Bull Run, that battle proves that that is not going to be the case, that the war is going to be long and it's going to be bloody. And it led to the Union developing the Anaconda Plan. Okay, the next battle we'll talk about is Antietam in 1862. Antietam basically halts the Confederate advance into the Union and ends up being the bloodiest single day of the war. So the South has had several successes and has been able not only to defend itself, but to actually invade into the North. So this battle halts that advance, but it's an incredibly costly battle, being the bloodiest single day of the entire war. Next, we have Gettysburg in 1863. So this is a huge turning point for the war, in that it really starts to show that the South isn't going to be able to hang on much longer. It was really the South's last hope of turning things around and basically keeping the North on the defensive. So it ends the South's hope of furthering that invasion in the North. And from here on out, the South is going to be on the defensive and not doing very well. This is also where Lincoln gives his Gettysburg Address that we'll talk about later. Okay, we have the Battle of Vicksburg, really the Siege of Vicksburg. So with Vicksburg, it's a fulfillment of another piece of the Anaconda Plan, taking control of the Mississippi and cutting the South in half. Next is Sherman's March, or Sherman's March to the Sea, where he's basically marching from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, burning as he goes. So the city of Atlanta is burned. Lots of other areas are burned and attacked as well. And Sherman's March to the Sea is really meant to sort of break the South morally, and also to break their sort of their will to fight, but also to cause huge economic damage. So Sherman's march, his march to the sea, demoralized the South. And then finally, we've got Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. So we have a series of small battles that lead up to this event, where basically the Confederacy just doesn't have um, enough resources or manpower to keep fighting. So it's at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, where General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union, effectively ending the Civil War. Okay, so some political issues that took place during the war. At the very beginning of the conflict, when states are starting to secede, Abraham Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland. Basically, what happens here is he declares martial law where the military is able to take control of the state, and he jails supporters of secession in Maryland. So, with those supporters jailed, it prevents Maryland from voting to leave the Union. And this was very controversial because there was no due process here. Because he declared martial law, he could put these men in jail for any reason without them going through the courts or going to a judge. But it does keep Maryland in the Union. Okay, the Union also has a draft. So this is forced military service. This is the first draft of American history. It's mostly targeting middle class and working class families, and it was incredibly controversial and unpopular in many parts of the Union because if you had money, you could basically pay to not have to go and fight. The cost was $300, which at that time was around $9,000, and the average person just could not afford to pay to avoid the draft. Excuse me. So it was so controversial, in fact, that it caused riots in New York City, where a lot of, especially Irish immigrants, rose up, burned buildings. They also attacked African Americans in the streets because they blamed African Americans for the war and saw the war as basically them being forced to fight for these other people. So all in all, about 120 people died in those riots. Okay, next are the Copperheads. So this is a nickname given to Union Democrats who criticized Lincoln in the war, and they sort of held sympathies for the South and basically wanted the government, the Union government, to make peace with the South. Next, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. This one can be really tricky um, because we do have the freeing of slaves, but we need to remember that it's not all slaves. And we also need to remember sort of the reason behind it. So the Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order of Abraham Lincoln, and it's seen as a war measure. Okay, it's part of his role as commander in chief. So in this war measure, it frees slaves, but only those in states of rebellion. So in the Confederate States only. And he does this to hurt the South's labor, to sort of cause chaos in the South, but also to encourage African Americans to serve in the Union Army. Okay, and this also keeps Britain and France out of the war because it makes the war even more about abolition and freeing slaves. The next is the Gettysburg Address. So this address is given a couple of months after the Battle of Gettysburg, where basically Lincoln is dedicating the battlefield to the war and to those who gave their lives fighting it. So it's a powerful speech by Lincoln, reaffirming the war effort to reunite the Union, to preserve the Union, to get those Confederate states back into the Union. Okay, we also have the 54th Massachusetts. This is a regiment in the Union Army. It's the most famous African American regiment of the Union Army. Um, Even though they were fighting and serving their country, they were discriminated against. They had to serve under white officers. They were paid less than white soldiers, and they were also very poorly supplied. They didn't get the same treatment as white regiments. Um, Despite all of that, they showed incredible courage and bravery and fought for their country. They led an assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston and really demonstrated to many in the military that both whites and blacks were equal in terms of um, the battlefield. And we're actually going to see that discrimination in the military is going to end quicker than discrimination in civilian life. It's going to be a slow process, but this really is sort of the beginning of that. Okay, that's the end of Civil War Week 2.